In part 4, we're going to start with documentation and continue with the sections from section F on to the end. Documentation. If standards say the auditor shall document, then you shall in some form or other. Otherwise, if someone says, I think you should document this, you say, please read 230A7. And here's 230A7. It is neither necessary nor practicable for the auditor to document every matter considered or professional judgment made in an audit. Further, it is unnecessary for the auditor to document separately, as in a checklist, for example, compliance with matters for which compliance is demonstrated by documents included within the audit file. And then they list some examples. What does that mean? Means that documenting in a checklist is okay. Said that. Means some things can be documented purely by responding to a checklist question. I like to have more checklist prompts just to remind myself of things I have to do and say, did we make sure we did this? Did we make sure we did that? Did we make sure we wrote down what we did when we did the inventory count? Because that's kind of necessary. It also means you don't have to document things twice. So if something is documented in one place, you don't have to document it in another place. You don't have to write 2 memos to document the same thing. Though, as I said, a checklist prompt for documentation may help remind you to document things. Now, the other documentation paragraph that I think is important and often overlooked is this one. You document overall responses. You document nature, timing, and extent of further audit procedures. Note extent is now the last thing we document because nature is the most important, timing is the second most important, and extent is the third and least important thing. B, linkage, and we'll talk about that, and results, including conclusions where these are not otherwise clear. So you don't have to document all your conclusions. 330.28 is pretty clear. Just document the results because the conclusion should be otherwise clear. Now, overall responses, we have to look in the appendixes, emphasize the need for professional skepticism. Oh, it says it may include. We may decide to emphasize the need for professional skepticism. So I'm going to have a checklist prompt that says I emphasized it. And I'm going to assign appropriate staff as opposed to assigning inappropriate staff. Checklist step that says I assigned appropriate staff. Change the procedures up and be unpredictable. Sometimes that's difficult to do. There is often only one way of doing something. But for instance, inventory counts. I'll count one city this year and another city next year. So the client doesn't say, oh, you're always going to count at head office. Some years we'll never count at head office because we don't need to. And then if risk of material misstatement is higher, substantive test done closer to period or more substantive, that's a may. That should be evident from the test. So that's not hard to do. Mostly a checklist will do it for us. It's also required for quality management reasons, so there's a simple response to that one. Document the audit procedures, A2, also required in 230, further audit procedures, and there are other procedures required in 230 as well. So that's simple and obvious. We should know that. The linkage of procedures performed with the assessed risks at the assertion level. If you're purely doing a procedural audit, doing this procedure, that procedure, this procedure, that procedure, you've not done this. You've not satisfied 330.28b. You have to say this procedure, this one, and this one address the risks of material misstatement at the assertion level of this. So a procedural audit will have no chance of doing this. You need to find a way to document that. And that's a really important form of documentation. It's very specific in standards. And often I see checklists and audit forms that just completely miss this. They just don't do it. I guess what they do is they just do so many audit procedures that a practice inspector goes somewhere or other in there, you did that. You haven't done it explicitly. You've done so much work. You must have done it. And then results of, if not clear. Now, I think you normally would document it if it wasn't clear. But it does say if the results are clear, you don't need to document anything else. The order to select procedures in. And I like the question, are we done yet? So every time you plan an audit procedure and start with the easiest first and move up to the hardest, are we done yet? So we'll do analytical procedures first. They're quick and easy. Next we'll do a walkthrough, kind of have to for D&I. And maybe we're just going to get some evidence of operating effectiveness at the same time. And we don't throw out observation, inspection, and inquiry either. And then further substantive procedures. So, analytical procedures. They are required as a risk assessment procedure. No evidence maybe, unless we find a way to update them to year end. They're simple. Document an expectation and have evidence. The expectation and the correspondence with the expectation gives you evidence. The other cool thing about analytical procedures is they often cover all assertions in a section. Often, detailed substantive procedures address only one assertion, and we do them in response to that assertion having a moderate or high risk of material misstatement. Now, substantive procedures are required for all components, and analytical procedures are. So after we've done a couple of nice, simple analytical procedures, are we done yet? And if risk of material misstatement is negligible, probably. So the next to select is a better analytical procedure. Not just sales this year to last year, but days sales and receivable, gross margin by product line, something like that. That's a better analytical procedure, gives us more evidence. Document an expectation. Are we done yet? Maybe we're awfully close now. A couple of good analytical procedures. Risk of material misstatement is low. Maybe we're almost done. What little bit of additional evidence can we get, either substantively or by testing control, to get us up to enough for low risk of material misstatement? So a systems walkthrough. One transaction from each type of transaction. Have to do it for designed and implemented and don't get any evidence. Add inquiry, observation, and reperformance. We've got some, as we talked about before. Are we done yet? For revenue? Maybe. For expense? Maybe. Maybe just a little bit more, but not a lot. Maybe a little bit more can be more extensive control tests. Those are often difficult to do, expensive to do, often fail. Corroboration might be a way of doing it. Can be easy and done by inquiry. Otherwise, we're probably not going to do more extensive control testing. They are a lot of work, a lot of time, and fail and don't necessarily give us a whole bunch more evidence. But are we done yet? Even more control testing, 60 walkthroughs, that's wonderful documentation. Takes a lot of time, often fails. So it's unlikely to be effective. It depends what we're trying to do. Are we trying to produce pretty documentation and provide employment for audit juniors? So 60 walkthroughs, probably not. And we're not walking through the financial reporting system. We're walking through the accounting system, which is not what we're required to do. Further substantive tests. Now, substantive tests are time-consuming and hard to do, but risk of material misstatement is high or moderate, so we got to do them. They should be easy to select because we know what the risk is, and we should be able to select a procedure that responds to that risk. And if risk of material misstatement is high, and if the substantive procedure necessary for that takes a while, oh well, that's what we need to do the audit properly. Paving the file with documentation. A lot of people like to do that. It's time consuming. And they say, well, the practice inspector wants to see all this documentation, so I'll do it to fool them. You're probably not going to fool the practice inspector. It's a complete waste of time. And if all we're doing is mindlessly documenting something, there could well be an undetected material misstatement that we have not identified because we didn't plan, we didn't do risk assessment procedures, and we didn't go looking for it. We've done a lot of tests of details that look very pretty, but an analytical procedure may have been much better than the test of detail and much more directly addressed material misstatement. Now, auditing by documenting, some things must be documented, inventory count procedures, so it would be convenient if the audit program says, I have documented the inventory count procedures on working paper blank. And then on a working paper blank, you write down what you did. You have to document your planning, though I don't know that writing a memo on planning is going to be complete enough. If you've done confirmations, we have to document that we did it independently. We did it. The client didn't do it for us. So again, having an audit program that says, here's what I did in the confirmation process, making it clear that I did it, not the client. I controlled it, not the client. Good idea. So the positives about that, if you have a clearly written memo, clearly brief, well-written memo on how we did the inventory count last year, if a new staff person comes along, they will now go, oh, okay, here's the client's phone number, here's the client's email address, here's what we did, here are the locations we visited, here's our rotation plan for visiting locations. I understand what to do. That's very useful to staff, and you have to spend less time explaining what to do. And is document things that have to be documented. So that's a well-written memo. The negatives of documenting by writing a bunch of memos. It may duplicate other documentation. Many big firms have a rule. You document only once. And the other thing about having two pieces of documentation on the same topic, they may contradict each other. They may leave, one document may say one thing, the other document may leave it out. If you want the practice inspector to get after you, that's exactly what I would do if I were a practice inspector. You said you did this here, but over here you didn't say you did it. What did you actually do? Your documentation is inconsistent. And you may spend and waste time documenting things that don't have to be documented. So try to make sure that you document only once. Now, inventory, for example, you need to keep it simple and provide guidance, but don't duplicate it. It's harder in a planning memo not to duplicate stuff. So perhaps what you do, if you're writing a memo, an additional memo, you say, in addition to matters documented on such and such a working paper, these are other things we did. And then you don't have inconsistent documentation. And then also you will make sure that you don't duplicate, because you're only talking about other things that you've done. So be careful as you write these long memos. Now, writing a planning memo, and I'd be very careful with this. I would be more inclined to have a checklist to guide me as to the things I'm supposed to do and document it in that fashion. But if you have a planning memo that says, staff met to discuss planning for such and such a client, well, you need to say who, because it's unlikely that it was everyone. And the partner has a responsibility to communicate planning decisions to people who weren't there, so you have to know who was and wasn't there. And the engagement partner kind of has to be there, guiding the process. Standards say so, common sense says so. So we discussed planning. Well, I guess what you now have to do is you have to write down all the components and all the assertions and say what the risk of material misstatement was by assertion. I'd rather have a standard form that did that. And we also considered fraud. Well, we've been careless with wording here. We don't care about fraud. We considered fraudulent financial reporting. So we're duplicating and missing stuff. I guess if we're going to write a detailed memo about it, we have to put the day and time down. But that's not really needed because our audit plan, particularly in a larger audit, probably developed over a number of days. So our checklist will document, well, on this day we did that, and on that day we did this. And also we have to communicate, if people weren't there, the engagement partner has to communicate to the people that weren't there. And so we need to document how that was done. Simple way I would say we did that was in our planning meeting we developed an audit program based on risk of material misstatement by assertion by component. And that's how we communicated to people what the partner wanted done. The answer is no. Wouldn't you agree that? No. But don't we have to document this? No. Shouldn't we document more than a checklist step? No. Shouldn't we test? No. So, wouldn't you agree with me that there are two answers with different results? No, I don't agree. Show me where it says that in standards. And if you can't, then no, I don't agree. Standards do not require that. And I've given you various places in standards where they say, no, you don't need to document everything. So quote some of those back to the person. If you say, oh, why, yes, I do agree we should document that, rats. Now I have to add a couple of pages of boilerplate to every audit, and I'll get ChatGPT to help me do that. So wouldn't you agree with me that? No. If you say, how did you comply with the following requirement in professional standards, I will then provide you with an answer. But I'm not going to just randomly agree to, wouldn't you agree to this? So answer to that question is no. Don't we have to document? No, we don't. 200A83, don't have to document everything, even in a checklist. Shouldn't we document more than a checklist step? No. And there are a bunch of different paragraphs that say, no, we don't have to do that. So if somebody says, shouldn't we document that, you need to have professional standards right at your fingertips and go, nope. For instance, firm resources include checklists. So no, I don't have to document more than a checklist step because I'm using firm resources, which professional standards say can include a checklist. So no. Shouldn't we test? Shouldn't we include this test on our audit? I saw it in my textbook. Nope. Audits are risk-based, not procedural, and as I say, the only exception to that is someone says, shouldn't we test the existence of inventory somehow? Yes, that's the one procedure that's specified in professional standards. We have to do something on the existence of inventory. We don't have to count, but we have to do something. Last comment on fooling the practice inspector, or we're doing this because the practice inspector said so, or we're doing this because the practice inspector wants it. Probably all those things are wrong. You probably can't fool the practice inspector. And the way you deal with the practice inspector is if they say, we think you should have done that, you say, give me a handbook reference, give me a standards reference. Or if they say, we think you should document this, you say, well, I don't think so, and here are my standards references. They're never going to point out if we're doing too much work. If we're doing too much work, way too much work on prepaid expenses, they're going to go, okay, if you want to do that, that's fine. You've clearly dealt with negligible inherent risk or low inherent risk. You probably over-assessed it at low. Fine. Now, if you're doing too much work, they may suspect that you don't know what you're doing. And they then may start asking you questions where you're either going to confirm that you don't know what you're doing, or you go, oh yeah, I know what I'm doing. Oh yeah, I know we did too much work there, but we'll do less next year. So if you're dealing with the practice inspector, you need to know the standards as well as they do. And if you don't, they're going to figure out pretty quick that you don't know the standards. And if you don't know the standards, then they're going to figure out pretty quick that you're probably not doing the audit right. And they will find a way to tell you, you got to start doing this. Now, if they tell you you've got to start doing this, what they really mean is you got to start assessing the risk of material misstatement and designing procedures in response. But it can come out pretty easily that, if you don't want to do that, then I guess on every audit, whether you need to or not, you got to document this. And doing it for the practice inspector means you don't know what you're doing. You don't know what you're doing. And the practice inspector probably knows that, and you probably can't fool the practice inspector. So it's a bad idea to do so. So, audit tips. What have we talked about? We talked about efficiency and effectiveness, planning. Talked about planning dead transactions. If it's a dead transaction, the odds that it can be wrong are pretty low. The risk model, we looked at the math that allows us to use the risk model and do less work, particularly if risk and material misstatement is negligible or low. Talked about a bunch of procedures that we're probably doing that we should probably stop doing. Talked about documentation, which is necessary, but over-documentation is unnecessary. Talked about the order in which to select procedures. Start with the simple, easy ones and move up through the hard ones as risk and material misstatement increases. Talked about paving the file with documentation, which is just generally a bad idea and leads anybody looking at your file to realize that you don't know what you're doing and you're not responding to risk and material misstatement. Questions to which the answer is no. No, don't need to do that. Show me where it says that in standards. And fooling the practice inspector, which you just probably can't do. You can have a fair discussion with the practice inspector saying, well, we think you should do that. And you say, well, where in standards? This is what I've done. This is how I've followed standards. And if you do that, the practice inspector will probably go, oh, okay, sorry, we didn't, we haven't spent a long time on your file, and now you've explained the complexities of the file and how you did it and how you addressed it. Okay, you're fine. You need to respond to the assess risk of material misstatement. I think that applies A through J, how you assess it and how you respond to it. And it's hard to do if you haven't planned the audit properly. So, thanks for listening.